You know, I'm here representing the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem as a Christian myself and as one who is pro-Israel. Is that me or what's the noise? Sorry. Okay. Yes. So I actually came here to talk to you about my garden, believe it or not. Right? Myself and my husband have a bit of land out the back, and you know, during the summer there we decided we'd plant lots of vegetables, and so we did. But the problem was we didn't look after the garden, and some very undesirable things began to grow, and we know what they're called. Weeds, stubborn, deep-rooted, life-sucking weeds. There's a huge, very deep-rooted weed that's sadly and disgracefully affecting much of the church today, unfortunately, and choking our relations with the Jewish community, worldwide, and the nation of Israel. This ugly weed is no respecter of persons or denominations. Its rhizomes, or creeping rootstocks, are very far-reaching. There's a name for this weed: supersessionism, or, in other words, replacement theology. This is the erroneous doctrine that God is now through with the Jewish nation. The blessings and promises bestowed on them no longer apply. Supersessionists teach that the church has replaced Israel. Those blessings and promises of the scriptures now belong to the church and only to the church. But my scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, Genesis chapter 17, verse 7, they say something different. Okay, so Genesis 17:7, God is speaking to Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. And he says, "And I will establish my covenant between you and your descendants after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you." This leaves no room for confusion. God's clearly not giving up on his people Israel. Again and again, in the scriptures we read that he says he will be their God for all time. And God's not fickle, you know. We might be, but he's not. He's not like us. It's hard to believe that the early shoots of this wild and undesirable plant were beginning to appear in the writings of the early church fathers. That is, from as early as the 2nd century of the Christian era. It's quite unbelievable that its roots go even further back. Okay? They go back to the 1st century, where Paul the Apostle, who was the author of most of the epistles in the New Covenant, or what the Christian people call the New Testament, and he deemed it necessary to address this issue. In his letter to the Romans, Paul wrote, "I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew," said the Jewish Paul, who was commissioned by God to the non-Jewish world. And that's just one of the many verses in the New Testament that totally dismantle the whole supersessionism argument. But you may ask, how could the church have strayed so far from our unquestioned questionable Jewish beginnings to believing such heresy. Let us again consider the analogy of the weed. Just like plants have a source, the weed also comes from a seed. What type of destructive seed could produce such an undesirable and pernicious plant? A seed called Jew hatred. A wicked seed that has been around for over 3,000 years. Another term for it, anti-Semitism. Thinking of the fruits. I think that most of the fruits of replacement theology are quite obvious. The devastating Christian crusades, the Inquisition, pogroms, violent riots that went on in the civilized world for many centuries, that involved arson, rape, mutilation, and the massacre of Jewish communities. And of course, there was the Holocaust. What lies at the heart of this weed of replacement theology is the lie that God breaks his promises. Now, that kind of thinking would certainly lead one to the following question. If God could so easily break it off with Israel and wash his hands clean of them, could he not also do the same with the church? Call it quits with them? With us? You know, it's time. It's high time we did some weeding. It's time to expose the heretical doctrine of replacement theology. It's time for the church in Ireland, and indeed around the world, to be willing to take off the shady lenses and see things for how they really are. And that's one objective of my book, Hey Ireland, Israel's on the Line, to remind the church of its historical roots, its historical ties to the Jewish nation, and to expose the stubborn, deep-rooted weed. You know, sometimes, I know for me anyway, I could be in somebody else's garden and look at a beautiful flower that I've never seen before. And there I am admiring it and saying, wow, what a beautiful flower. Until I'm told, that's actually a weed. Sometimes somebody's got to point it out. The book is broken into 3 parts. The first part explains Israel's beginnings from almost 4,000 years ago and the Jewish nation's historical ties to the land of Israel. Parts 2 and 3 in the same book delve into the geography, history, and politics. And my goal in that is to bring a fresh perspective, especially to the undecided, to the confused and the ignorant. It's time for Ireland to hear the real facts about Israel's modern history and Israel's true dealings with the exploited and indoctrinated Palestinian people. But you'll also be relieved to know that there's lots of good news in this book too. It has plenty of fascinating testimonies and statements by Arabs and Palestinians who support Israel, some of whom have come from terrorism and jihadist backgrounds. In fact, one of them, Mossab Hassan Youssef, known as the Green Prince, the son of Hamas. I think he wrote the book, The Son of Hamas, and he's called the Green Prince, or perhaps he's written both books, but I'm forgetting those details. But he's the son of one of the founding leaders of the Hamas terror organization, and he's seen the light. He says, one of his quotes from the book is that Israel helps the Palestinian people more than anyone else. And this is true. And I'll just add to that, I was speaking in a church a few weeks ago about the book, And I was approached by an Iraqi gentleman whom I'd never met before. And he was saying, you know, he'd love to buy the book, but he had no money, blah, blah, blah. And then he went on to say that, you know, it's amazing what Israel has done even for our country in Iraq, for the children in Iraq, for the people of Iraq. But people don't know this. He says all Christians need to stand with Israel. There are some very interesting Irish people who stand with the State of Israel in its battle against terrorism. I could tell you about Irish filmmaker Nicky Larkin, about his conversion testimony. That is his conversion from being pro-Palestine to being pro-Israel. But I won't. You'll have to buy the book. Instead, I'll read to you an excerpt. Here are some thoughts from Irish actor Rory Cowan that you can find in the book. It's just a part of a speech that he gave a few years ago. Quote, "My parents never tolerated an inkling of discrimination or prejudice in our house. I grew up knowing prejudice and discrimination was wrong. It was bred into me. And if I'd gone to Israel in 1981 and I'd seen anything like prejudice or discrimination, I would never have gone back. But I never did. So I keep going back all the time. It's a wonderful country," he said, "with wonderful people. I can't see any difference between the tactics of the Israel boycotters and the Nazi brown shirts. I really can't. I would never support a cultural boycott of Israel," said Rory Cowan. Almost 10 years of research, writing and updating have gone into this book. There's ample facts, statistics and quotations, carefully documented and referenced proof that Israel is a democratic state, without a doubt. It has a population of over 9 million people, 21% of which is Arab. Hey Ireland, Israel is on the line, discredits those accusations of apartheid, colonialism, war crimes, etc., etc., etc. In closing, the highest ranked Muslim in the Israel Defense Force, IDF Major Ala Wahib, calls Israel a country that he, a Muslim, let's not forget, is, quote, proud to call home, end quote. In fact, he unapologetically declares that Israel, quote, sure as hell isn't an apartheid state. So, the bookstalls at the back. I'm selling them in the bookshops for €13, but you can get yours tonight for €10, so don't miss out.